Eros and Civilization is the most well-known work by social philosopher Herbert Marcuse. Now, to understand today's book, we have to remember a little bit about the book we did previously, which was Sigmund Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. Eros and Civilization was basically written as a commentary to Freud's vision. And if you would remember a little bit about Freud's vision, it was basically that there's an inevitable tension between society and the individual. Why is that? Because the individual has all this instinctual drives towards pleasure and aggression, and he has to sacrifice these drives in order to fit into normal human civilization. But to repress desire leads to unhappiness, to say the least, feelings of guilt, frustration, and the tension that just comes from not being able to do what your instincts are dictating to you, which is such a big part of the human condition. And Freud at the end, he said, well, he sort of threw up his hands and he says, it's inevitable, it cannot be changed. Civilization is based on the permanent subjugation of the human instincts. Now, naturally, one would expect that people will see if there's a way out of this stalemate. And Herbert Marcuse made such an attempt in his Eros and Civilization. So Marcuse follows in the psychoanalytic tradition to a certain extent, accepting many of their ideas. And a little bit about him. He was a part of a very famous group of intellectuals in post-World War II, World War II era Germany called the Frankfurt School. So along with people like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, a group of very, very influential thinkers who after World War II, specifically after the Allied powers won the war and basically reshaped the modern world, the ideas of these theorists became very, very influential. More than one can actually, not necessarily so explicitly clear, they weren't necessarily superstars, but if you would go look at their ideas and how much they've influenced the world, it was very vast. So Marcuse was part of the school, and during Nazi occupation of Germany, they were kicked out. They were kicked out because they were seen as to be too radical or liberal or a threat to fascist doctrine. And they were, many of them left to England, and a large bunch of them went to America, amongst whom was Marcuse. And he was later then, he studied and taught also at Columbia University and other universities in America. And it is during this time in America, he was also, during World War II, he was part of the World War II effort, the American effort, working in the Civil Bureau of Research. He then later published this Eros and Civilization as a response to Freud. And the book is very complicated. It's highly academic work in a certain extent. So a lot of social critique and commentary on capitalism and technological society and all these things. But basically, the gist of it is that Marcuse is saying, why does society need to be repressive? It is possible. It must be possible to create a non-repressive society. That is the ideal that he sets off with. For Freud, thought it was impossible. He said naturally civilization must mean repression. But Marcuse said no. Let us create a non-repressive society, a society in which human instinct can just be facilitated. He said now it is possible by virtue of technology and what humans have, it is possible to create such a society. And Marcuse is interesting because he became known as the father of the New Left. Because during the 1960s, which was in a great turmoil, a period of great social upheaval in America and in the world at large, specifically amongst the students and the hippies of that era, he became a little bit of a cult figure almost, even though he himself was a straight-cut academic, but he would go in his suit and his tie to many of these student rallies, and he would address the students in the crowds. And he would, because he saw within these student rebellions the seed of the birth of his utopian vision, the birth of starting to create a society that is non-repressive. Because the counterculture was basically, their revolution was against society which was seen to be overly controlling and overly materialistic ultimately. It was pushing people to work and produce and being very tightly grabbing people and putting them into a mold that was expected of them. Work, buy, consume, die. and they were trying to break free from that. And Marcuse was saying, yes, that is the way to go. And a large part of that was also his ideas of sexual liberation, which was a large part in that counterculture era. A lot of it sort of revolved around the idea that by free sex and free drugs, by sort of just breaking any constraints that was there, even from traditional society, some of that is the way towards creating a better world, a society that is non-repressive. Now, we can appreciate the urge for freedom, and we can appreciate that specifically that counterculture era was rebellion against a society that was overly materialistic, just pushing people towards producing and working and making money. And there's no satisfaction or happiness in that. Naturally, one can expect a kickback. But whether it is possible to create a non-repressive society in a world that we inhabit, that is something that the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita and the teachings of yoga cannot agree with, because there is one problem. Now, basically, Marcuse's strategy is not new, even though it is couched in very intellectual language and using all kinds of political terms. It is basically hedonism, the idea that somehow sensual pleasure is the highest good, and that pursuing sensual pleasure, all good will come as a result. So there is the idea that somehow by giving free vent to sensual desire, then also the problems in human psychology will be solved. Now, Marcuse is not the only person. There's, for example, Wilhelm Reich was another very alternative, very eccentric German commentator on Freud, who was also pushing in that direction, that somehow it is just by abandoning restraint that all good will come. But it is there in the ancient world as well. We see it in ancient Greece, we see it even in ancient India, that somehow it comes up again and again. Maybe that's the solution. But the Bhagavad Gita explains something very sober. It takes a sober vision about sensual indulgence, and it tries to remind us that whether you're living in the year 2020, 1960s, or 1000 BC, or 4000 years into the future, there are certain parameters that don't change, and one of them is that sensual indulgence cannot lead to satisfaction. Yat pritivyam vrihi yavam iranyam pashavam striya nalam ekasya tatsarvam iti madva shamam vrajet. Understanding that all that is available on earth in the form of food, gold, property, and sex is not enough for one person, one should go about with a peaceful mind. So that is the perennial dynamics of lust and greed. It cannot be satisfied. Just like supplying fuel to a fire will never be able to put out a fire. It will just increase the flames. So similarly, that is the interesting feature of sensual indulgence, is that it cannot be satisfied by sensual experience. So there's the dynamics of satisfaction that is not being able to attain by going for it. And similarly also the reality that sensual indulgence brings about also, it comes at a cost. It brings about weakness. If one overindulges in any kind of sensual experience, overly stimulates the mind and body, one will have bad consequences. Food, sex, drugs, alcohol, whatever it is, take your pick of sensual experiences. But if one goes for it too much, if one overly stimulates oneself, then the body, the health, and the mind will suffer as a result. Then added further to the complication is the dynamics of addiction. That is very serious. That we see if one becomes addicted to any sensual experience, then one's life becomes very, very complicated. Whatever it is, even something that we all do every day, food, if one becomes addicted to eating, then your life becomes very difficult. Because an addiction means that a sensual instinct, a drive, now overpowers the intelligence. You are not able to anymore to regulate your experience according to the dictates of reason and what is healthy. So we see that one has to always be careful of sensual indulgence. because it has to be done with prudence. The middle ground has to be walked. And to simply think that one can create a non-repressive society, even by restructuring society however you want to, you can, whatever you want to do on a political and structural realm, this won't change the existential dynamics of how desire works within the heart of the living being. And we saw that also in the counterculture, how free sex and drug use, it looked very innocent in the beginning, but later on, there's also the dark side of that culture. You have rape, you have when the hard drugs entered in, the hippie scene also turned a little bit morbid, because it's one thing just chilling out and smoking some pot, but once you start shooting up heroin or crack, then things get a little more risky. So naturally we see, therefore the Bhagavad Gita explains us that there's a difference between shreyas and prayas, between short-term benefit and long-term benefit. And being part of being human means to develop the ability to go for long-term benefit, to sacrifice short-term pleasure for long-term benefit. And all social institutions, ultimately just that. In marriage you sacrifice sexual plurality, but then you gain also something. You gain fidelity and you gain social stability. Where even if you just follow a diet, you're doing the same thing. It would be nice to every day just eat ice cream and pizza, but at the same time you realize, oh, what will happen to me? So there's just something that has to be embraced. The reality that human life means, it includes a certain sense of discipline, because in human life one has the ability to regulate himself according to wisdom. Wisdom is different than instinct, because our instincts has to ultimately conform to wisdom. And in the Bhagavad Gita we see a vision that sense of pleasure is not bad. It's just something that comes as a natural consequence of life within this world. Just like suffering comes automatically, pleasure also comes automatically. But the important thing is that we live our life according to principles. The principles of intelligence, of wisdom, principles of a good life. And then in that way our instinct becomes regulated and wholesome, and that is the proper balance that is there. But we appreciate that the goal is freedom, and that is a fact, that the soul ultimately is looking for freedom. The restraint and repression is ultimately, it is artificial. The soul wants to just express itself completely, and it wants to go for happiness. By nature, the soul is pleasure-seeking. But that pleasure is not found on a material platform, that the pleasure that we are seeking, because the soul is ultimately different than the material body. And pleasure should be sought on the spiritual platform. So the practice of self-realization, realizing the bliss of the soul, and the bliss of the soul's relationship with God. There, one can find a source of pleasure that can be freely indulged in, become deeply absorbed in, and the results of that is good. So the urge to freedom must lead one to seek enlightenment. It is in this pursuit of enlightenment that it is possible to attain peace. Apuryamanam achala pratishtam samudram apa pravishanti yadvat tatvat kamayam pravishanti sarve sashantim apnoti nakama kami. A person who is not disturbed by the incessant flow of desires that enter like rivers into the ocean, which is ever being full but is always still, can alone achieve peace, and not the man who strives to satisfy such desires.